Good morning, everybody. I thank Mr. Dannenberger for inviting me here. And he tells me that you've read The Roundhouse. How many of you like that book? Hey, I did too. I love that book, in fact. I thought it had great plot, good characterization, and it really gave a really accurate picture of life on a contemporary reservation. The Ojibwe Reservation, in this case, one of the Ojibwe reservations. So today, that is my raison d'etre, my reason for being here, is to introduce you guys to contemporary Native American communities. It is an introduction. I could give a whole year course on Native communities. I could give a whole year course on Native communities in Connecticut. So it is a very sparse introduction, and I'm going to focus on Native communities on reservations. There are many Native communities that aren't on reservations. There are concentrations living in cities or out in the boondocks that are not overseen by government officials. They are strictly come together, Indian people and people of color wanting to come together for support. And these things sprung up right as soon as the historic period began and the Europeans started to settle in Connecticut. So, federal census, recent federal census says that there are 5.2 million people in the United States alone who consider themselves indigenous. Indigenous, which means Native American or Eskimo, what people call Eskimo. Eskimos call themselves Inuit, by the way. Eskimo is actually a term that other tribes applied, especially the Cree applied to them. The Cree live south of the Eskimo peoples, and Eskimo, of course, means eaters of raw fish. A lot of Inuit don't like that. They call themselves the Inuit, which means the people or the real people. So there are 5.2 million. There's probably more than that. There are hundreds of Native American communities in the United States. If you counted Canada and Central and South America and the archaeological cultures, there are thousands of these societies. And there is no one great Native American culture. There is no one great Native American political organization. Each tribe considers itself unique, a separate sovereign nation. They don't make strong alliances. They usually don't trust each other because they have histories of conflict, as the Ojibwe have with the Dakota Sioux, who lived west of them. There was a historic conflict throughout history. So they have different cultures, different histories. It's like comparing the French with Chinese, Mexicans with Germans. Very, very different. Kwakiutl from, and this fellow over here is a Kwakiutl from Northwest Coast. Their cultures are, their traditions, their belief systems, their origin, their ideas of origin are very different from those, say, Pueblo Hopi in the Southwest, Cayuga Iroquois, Cayuga tribe, Iroquois speakers, up in New York State, the Seminole down in Florida, and of course the Eastern Cherokee down there. All very, very different people. Even their physical features, if you look at these examples I have up here, there is no one Indian look. They have different hair texture, different hair color, different eye shape, different skin tones, and these are the full-blooded ones I'm talking about. Once you get into mixed blood, and there are many mixed blood Native peoples because their tribes were so decimated by European diseases and European wars, poverty. In fact, it's been estimated that in New England alone, by 1650 AD, 77 to 90% of the Indian population had been liquidated, killed off, mostly by diseases. So, they're very different. And I probably should say that a lot of the mixed bloods live east of the Mississippi, because west of the Mississippi, some of these tribes didn't see a white guy till 1880, 1890. Whereas here, along the East Coast in New England, there were Europeans coming here. A lot of them started coming well before the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were not the first Europeans to land in New England, 1620. When they landed, they were actually greeted by an Indian speaking English who said, "What cheer, Englishmen?" And then they sort of scattered out and started to vandalize some of the empty Indian villages around. They even dug up a couple of burials. And who's at the bottom at one of those burials? There's a white guy with red hair with English clothing on. So they were not the first here. We actually know documentation is that the earliest documented Europeans were John Cabot, who was an Italian sailing for the English. 1497, he sails into the Canadian Maritimes. And the next year, he's joined by his son, Sebastian, and they sail from along the eastern coast, from eastern Canada, all the way down to the Carolinas. This is 1497, 1498. Before them, the Vikings. There is actually a major Viking settlement in Newfoundland. It was radiocarbon dated to 1003 AD. It's a world archaeology site. It's called Lanza Meadows. You can actually go and visit it. Vikings were here in 1003, and we know that they went up and down the coast too, because Viking artifacts have been found. There was a coin found in Maine in one of the Indian settlements. So the East Coast is being bombarded by Europeans really, really early. And what that means is they're being bombarded by European diseases. Plague, smallpox, typhus, even measles. They died of childhood diseases. They had no immunity to any of these diseases at all. And whole villages were wiped out. And so that's why we had such small, by 1800s, we have very, very small communities. And in order to continue the community, the Indian community, Indian women had to marry out. Either that or they were marrying their brothers. And they don't do that in Indian society. So they tried to marry other Indians first, but those Indian societies were just as small. So they had to marry out into free blacks and white societies. And that's why a lot of them are mixed blood. But that doesn't mean they aren't any Indians, because Indianness not only has to do with genealogy, it also has to do with sharing cultural traditions, ancient cultural traditions that have come down through thousands of years, and sharing histories. So, I don't want you to go away thinking that mixed bloods aren't Indians. They are. Okay, what do I want to say here? There we go. What I want to talk about is, I'm going to talk about reservations in the West. Specifically, I chose the example of the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is in South Dakota, for two reasons. One is there is a lot of studies that have been done on Pine Ridge. A lot is known about it, and it has major historical significance. Pine Ridge is where, in 1890, the massacre of Wounded Knee occurred. There's books written about that, where the U.S. cavalry actually attacked an unarmed Indian village, mainly women and children, and just killed everybody off. And Wounded Knee was also the location for a Native American protest in the 1970s. Native leadership protesting the way the government treated Indian peoples. Actually, held the area hostage for a number of weeks in the 1970s. Also, another reason I'm going to zero in on Pine Ridge is because it's very close to the Ojibwa homelands, which are just adjacent in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And the Ojibwas people, by the way, Ojibwa is not their real name. Ojibwa is the name that other Indians and Euro-Americans gave them. It actually means, it's an Algonquian term, and it actually means puckered up. And it refers to their moccasins. Their traditional moccasins had a central pucker in it. The Ojibwa people themselves call themselves the what do they call them? The Anishinabeg. The Anishinabeg, as I screwed up that poor name. But anyway, that means in Ojibwe Algonquian dialect, that means the true people or the original people. And many Native American names for themselves mean that. They call themselves the real people, the true people, the original people. But the Ojibwas, although they actually live in eastern woodlands, they live in the very western portion of the eastern woodlands, and they do speak Algonquian. And people in New England all speak Algonquian as well, Eastern Algonquian, and people in New England are living in the eastern woodlands too. Yet the Ojibwe, really their histories and a lot of their culture is more similar to the more western tribes up there, like the Oglala Sioux, who live on the Pine Ridge Reservation. So that's why I'm zeroing in on Pine Ridge. And Pine Ridge, it was originally called the Great Sioux Reservation. It's located in South Dakota, and it was created in 1868 after one of the Indian Wars with the Sioux, the Fort Laramie Treaty. And the Sioux were forced to live on this reservation. It was a really crummy land, and you can see it, and I have other pictures, but it's very marginal land. Here it is. It's prairie and arid desert. There is very little agricultural land on there. There's very little water. There's virtually no building materials. I don't know why they call it Pine Ridge, because that's about the only scrub pines you're going to see in the area. Most of it is just grassland and very sandy soils. It was originally 60 million acres in 1868. Today, it's only 2.8 acres. Where did all that 57 million plus acres go? Broken treaties. The United States is famous for breaking treaties with tribes. Crucial treaties, too, because the lands that were sold off were the best lands. They sold them, of course, to white settlers or mining companies, logging companies. When we talk about the Great Lakes areas, the Great Lakes reservations, and corrupt Indian agents. The United States always sets up this set of, it's an overseer system. It's called an overseer system here in New England. Out there they call them Indian agents, but they're middle class, upper class white guys that are put in charge of reservations. They usurp the roles and responsibilities of tribal leadership, and they do their best to try to detribalize people, to force them to assimilate to white culture. And this is what I don't know if you've studied any of this, but this is what the Indian boarding schools are about. Horrible, horrible places. And they didn't only have them back west, they had them back east too. There's a famous one in Pennsylvania called the Carlisle School. It had over 10,000 Indian students that went there in the years it was open, and what they did was they forced these kids to stop speaking their language, to stop doing any cultural traditions. They couldn't practice their religion. In fact, does anybody know when the United States Congress passed the Native American Freedom of Religion Act that finally allowed Indians to practice their own religion? 1975. And Native people weren't considered citizens. They are our First Nations, first settlers here, but they were not considered citizens. They didn't have any rights of citizens, and especially on the reservations. That's why we have such a mess on some of them now. Even though they were enlisted in all of our wars, Native people were in our military all the way back to the French and Indian Wars. Rogers Rangers, famous guerrilla warfare group of Americans. Most of them were Indians, a lot of them from Connecticut. Revolutionary War, same thing. A lot of our local militias had Native people in them. In fact, there was a specific Indian company formed by the Stockbridge Mohicans out of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. That was a famous Christian Indian community. And a lot of Connecticut Indians, including the Scotticook, actually belonged to that Indian company. They also fought guerrilla warfare. They were so good, they almost captured the English commander in Western Connecticut. Colonel Simcoe, I think his name was. He was so enraged that he planned an ambush, and during the Battle of the Bronx, they actually ambushed the Indian company and killed off 1/3 of them. There's a monument in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx to this company. So how did I get off on this? Tangents. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about, I want to talk about the conditions on Pine Ridge. They're terrible. Pine Ridge is one of the most impoverished sections in the United States, if not the most impoverished. As you can see, these are not extreme pictures of the reservation, folks. These are typical pictures of this reservation. This house is a typical house on the reservation. This is the front yard. Another house, front yard. There is no garbage pickup, no weekly garbage pickup up there. Their houses are small, in vast need of repair. This is the backyard that their children get to play in. This is the interior of one, cramped conditions. That's a little girl taking a bath in the kitchen sink. Unemployment rate is 70% on this reservation. And this is a big reservation. There are thousands of people on this reservation. There are 5 Indian towns, as well as a lot of rural areas where people live. Rampant substance abuse. You can see here's one of those inebriated persons. It has been estimated that 62% of the adults living on Pine Ridge Reservation are alcoholics. Shocking suicide rates, and of course the suicide and the alcoholism and the drug abuse all stems from depression and their low esteem due to their very sad histories with the United States and the present living conditions. There are high rates of violence on the reservation. There are gangs on the reservation. It's been estimated there are 5,000 gang members in Pine Ridge alone. And there was a study done on, you all know that the main theme of the Roundhouse centers around the rape of one of the women leaders there. And the rape is not, sadly, it is not uncommon on reservations. A study was done and it showed that 46% of Indian women, 46%, have been either raped, beaten, or stalked in their lifetime. And 80% of those rapes were done by non-Indians, by whites or blacks that are coming onto the reservation for the specific purpose of doing that deed. And many of them go unpunished. A lot of Indian women are missing. They are presumed to have been murdered during one of these acts of violence or sold into white slavery. Indian children have it very bad. They're coming from these very disturbed homes. And a lot of them are, and there is a lot of discrimination. Especially, there is always, most states have a very contentious relationship with their local Indians. Connecticut does. Montana and Dakota certainly do. I heard a talk at Yale by an Indian woman. She had her Ph.D. in history or sociology, and she gave a talk at one of the Yale seminars. She was a Salish from Montana, which is fairly close to Dakotas. And she was talking about child incarceration. And she had a personal experience. Her nephew was arrested. In Montana and Dakotas, in these towns, they have baby handcuffs that fit 8, 9, and 10-year-old children. The sheriffs carry them. And they are arrested regularly. And in fact, in her instance, her nephew, who was 9 years old at the time, and spent a number of years in adult prisons because he had a temper tantrum at school, and he threw over his school desk. Now, a lot of white kids do that too, but in this case, the teacher called the sheriff. They arrested him for, I think it was assault or something, and he was put in handcuffs, carted away, and he was in adult prisons and even mental institutions for several years, in and out. And they finally got him out, mainly because of her status, and she knew to go to the media. It was on television in Connecticut. I saw it on television. For throwing over a desk several years. So, and violence is not new to them. The Indian boarding schools, if they spoke their language or tried to practice one of their religions, they were punished severely. And I'm not talking about spending an hour in a classroom doing extra homework. We're talking about beatings, being incarcerated, put in solitary confinement. There was one woman, I heard a talk, I was actually at the Stockbridge Muncie Reservation for a seminar. A woman gave a talk there about people's experiences as children at these boarding schools, and there was one woman who talked about as a child, and this is contemporary, we're talking about within the last 10 years, she was in school and they were being retaught their language. And of course, many native tribes have lost their language but are trying to bring them back. But she was taught her language, and she learned some words in that language. I don't remember whether she was Potawatomi. It was a Great Lakes tribe. And she came home. She was so happy. She wanted to tell her grandmother. And she went to her grandmother, and she spoke the words in the language to her grandmother. And her grandmother came over and gave her this whop across the face and said, "Don't ever speak those words again." And of course, she was very upset. And she later found out that her grandmother had been at a boarding school as a child, and the first few days when she was at school, she spoke some of her native language to one of her friends. The teacher dragged her into this room where there was a guy, and they said, "Put your hand on the table." They did, and the guy chopped off her finger. So she went back in and told her friend what happened, and she said it in the language, back into the room, chopped off the other finger. And this is what it was. The grandmother remembered this from so back. She did not want anybody to hurt her granddaughter for speaking their language. This is so sad, really. So, anyway, that's why you have these suicidal tendencies, these substance abuse, these Great Depressions, and a lot of the violence. And there is a lot of racial discrimination. You can't see it from there, but this picture is a local tavern, and there's a sign right in the back that says, "We don't serve Indians." So, so this is This is pretty much the dark side of reservation life. And this is not just true of Pine Ridge. As I said, many of the western reservations, this is typical. And why? Why is this, of course? Of course, there's a whole list of stuff I have here, but basically what it comes down to are the very unjust wars caused by the United States because they wanted Indian lands. They wanted Indian lands mainly for their reservation resources. In the Great Lakes region, it was logging. They wanted the trees. In the western reservations, a lot of times it's mineral rights. Gold in the Black Hills, which were very sacred to the Sioux. And that's where the Sioux Wars started. And then, of course, the Indians lost the war, and the government made a treaty with them and continuously broke those treaties. That 60 million acres dwindled down to 2.8 of very marginal land. Those are due to broken treaties. The government continually selling off land that they told the Indians they would have forever, including the best lands so Native people could be self-sufficient. Indian leadership knew these things were happening, so a lot of times in the treaties there are actually clauses that say that the United States government will provide the Indians with food and cloth for making clothing, because especially on this Fort Laramie one, the buffalo had been totally decimated. Buffalo was their main staple. It provided their food, it provided clothing, it provided everything. And white hunters totally overkill. The buffaloes are practically endangered species now. So, and of course, broken treaties again. A lot of times the United States never sent the food, never sent the clothing. People were literally starving on these reservations. There's photos of them in the 1890s and early 1900s. And also corrupt Indian agents who were making money by selling the food elsewhere or buying really rotten food so they could pocket the other money, selling off lands. And basically that is the reason. White greed and white destruction of native environments. And that's why you have it. And here's some more pictures of the reservation, and check it out. I mean, this is sand. This isn't even soil here. And there's their home, another home down here. And for miles, you're out in the boondocks too. That's another thing. You are hundreds of miles from any white cities where you can't just go off reservation and go to a Stop and Shop to get food. You're going to have to go several hundred miles in order to get into any of these centers where you have stores or cultural centers or universities, education. And that, by the way, is very different than the East. The East, you don't have these long distances or these huge reservations. There is a light side to reservation life, though, and that is that strong leadership and a very resilient community. Community is very important to Native peoples, to a lot of non-Western peoples. We've sort of lost our sense of community in America because individualism has come to the fore here, and we're very much into individualism. But there is a lot to say about communities and community support of individuals. So they have a very resilient community, and it's based on these ancient cultural traditions and kinship, keeping them together. And there's strong leadership, and so they want to continue. They never give up. Even here in the East, they never give up, despite government pressures, political actions against them, impoverishment. They continue on, and contemporary communities has a big emphasis on education. They actually, some of the federally recognized tribes actually have their own Indian-run schools, Indian-run universities. There are a number of major universities now that are accredited that are bent on teaching Native people to become leaders in their tribes and how to become leaders. There's an emphasis on conservation and bringing back some of these marginal environments back to producing food and animal life. There's also tribal efforts to reduce substance abuse. They've actually set up health clinics on the reservation, and also initiated economic growth through small businesses. A lot of the conservation effort includes employing tribes. And of course, also a big emphasis on Native American traditional arts.
What is that unusual mask that the person's wearing?
Oh yeah, that's one of them. That's a major ceremony, and I can't remember what ceremony that was, but it's he's portraying a spirit guide. Oh, and this is just a quote from Winona LaDuke, who is an Ojibwa activist. She's from the White Earth Reservation, and I put this in because some of the monies that come for this restoration of the reservations comes from the government. But the tribes don't like to use the government grants because they're only small, they're seed monies, and basically the only ones they really give a lot of funding for are things that the government wants, like if they want to put a toxic waste dump up on the reservation, or casinos or something, and that's exactly what she says. She says, I think it's federal doublespeak or forked tongues. The federal government likes to support sovereignty of Indian tribes when we talk about nuclear waste dumps and casinos and toxic waste dumps, but doesn't support their sovereignty when they try to do something which is absolutely healthy, sustainable development with grassroots initiatives. She does a lot of speaking, goes all over the United States speaking, and she's a great speaker. If she ever comes into your area, really should try and hear some of the stuff she says. Okay, so now I want to get into the East and Eastern reservations, which are very different from the West. The cultures are very different. The histories are very different. I told you a little bit about the early histories. And because of those very different histories, you find that the problems on the reservations are very different. Oh, let's see, where am I? I bring these notes, but I never use them, so.
About 7 minutes. Give about 7 minutes left.
7 minutes?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, this won't take too long then. Okay. Native peoples in the East are very urbanized, very suburbanized. There is very easy short travel from the reservations to major white cities and cultural centers. And for this reason, Native peoples in southern New England are well-educated, middle class, and you don't have that extreme poverty or those that substance abuse or violence on their reservations. Many of the people, Native people in Connecticut, have masters and Ph.D s. They're doctors, they're lawyers, tradespeople, educators. For example, Trudy Richmond up here is a Schaghticoke elder. She just retired from being director of public programming at the Mashantucket Museum. She has degrees in education and in anthropology. She's an author. Besides also being a very traditional person, she's a master storyteller. And she's an activist. She was one of those who was at the Wounded Knee protest in the 1970s. And so they're they're very different makeup. Their problems are basically seeking control of the reservations, which they don't have unless you're federally recognized, and being forced to prove their Indianness because they are all mixed blood. And of course I went into that mixed blood thing, but a lot of people who are trying to get their reservations will try and say they aren't Indians because they're mixed blood. Native people have never had a blood quotient. That is a white man's thing. In fact, it was the federal government who forced Native people to have quotients when they set up reservations out west, because they wanted to get these people off the reservations and get the reservation lands for themselves. So they said you had to be 1/4 blood Indian. But Native people have always adopted in. In fact, there was a Jesuit priest who, the Jesuits, of course, came over to proselytize the Indians in Canada. And he was writing from Canada in 1600 AD. He wrote back to Paris, and he said, I visited a Seneca Indian reservation, a Seneca Indian village the other day. And he said, but most of the people living there were not Seneca. And that's because the Seneca had low birth rates, and they would adopt people in, marry them in, adopt them in. And that's a normal thing with Native people. They adopted a lot of whites in. In fact, a lot of white towns in New England passed laws that said white people could not go Indian because so many people were joining Indian societies. Indian societies were very egalitarian. They were very free and open, and people could do a lot of things in Native societies, especially women. Native women could vote. White women couldn't. Native women could hold office. There were squaw sachems that controlled villages. White women couldn't. Native women could own property. White women couldn't. Their husbands owned everything, and if they weren't married, their fathers owned everything. Even if they inherited it, it went right to one of those men. White women could not have a trade. Indian women could. And white women didn't have any control over the children. The husband did. Indian women did because they were in her lineage and her clan. And Indian women could divorce. Just take the husband's stuff, put it outside the wigwam, you're divorced. White women could not. So a lot of white women stayed. There was a famous example of Eunice Williams, a prominent family from Deerfield. Deerfield was attacked during the French and Indian Wars by French Indians from Canada, and people were killed, and other women and children were abducted, including Eunice Williams and her younger brother. They were taken up to Canada. After the war, brother came back home. Eunice did not. She did not want to come home. She stayed there. She married an Iroquois leader. She would write letters back to Deerfield. She would come and visit Deerfield, but she always went back. So, anyway, forced to prove their Indianness and control of the reservation. They don't have control. Even though they've been recognized by the colony and state of Connecticut since the very beginning of the colony, you don't control your reservations, your government does. The government still has an overseership here. The Department of Environmental Protection is the overseer of Indian tribes in Connecticut. There were over 21 Indian tribes in 1625 in Connecticut. Today, the government only recognizes 5. There are other tribes, but they don't recognize them. They recognize the Schaghticoke in Kent, the Golden Pagusset with a reservation, a small reservation, 1/4 of an acre left of their reservation in Trumbull, and another reservation, 160 acres, I think, over in Colchester, that the government recognizes because they realized that all of their land was sold illegally. And then there's the Eastern Pequot in North Stonington, and Mohegan in Uncasville, and Mashantucket Pequot near Ledyard. Mohegan and Mashantucket, those are the ones with the big casinos. They're federally recognized. The other ones are not. And you only have control over your reservation if you are federally recognized, and that's one of the main reasons Native people want federal recognition, not casinos. Casinos are a white man's thing. It's their white backers. The Bureau of Indian Affairs which is not a friend of Indians, believe me, that was actually part of the War Office. That's how it was created. Make Indians go through hoops to prove that they're Indian. And why do they have to prove they're Indian? No other ethnic group in America has to go through federal recognition, just Indian peoples. So that's why they want to become federally recognized, and that's why they're working towards federal recognition. Some of them, the Schaghticoke and the Eastern Pequot, actually were given federal recognition in 2004, and the state of Connecticut officials made a very strong appeal to try and get that overthrown, along with some private groups, and they did. They got it overthrown, which is unheard of. It had never been done before. So, about done?
Yeah, we're
Okay, folks.